Welcome to Bar and Blog Solo, and I'm here to remind you that sometimes conceptualizations do matter because they teach you how to think about the material world. Not because they determine the material world. In fact, I believe that material world is mostly determinative of these thoughts, not determined by these thoughts, although they are in a feedback loop, just not an equal feedback loop. I've said that a lot lately. Maybe today is where I finally go into what I mean by that. But we need to break down political action into a few different layers, and people get really, really confused by these layers. People will confuse tactics for strategy, strategy for grand strategy, orientations for tactics, principles as tactics, and confuse them all. And this is not good. These distinctions need to be sharp for a reason, because cutting through bullshit and making sure that you have scaffolded your ability to transition what you're doing in any objective, not just obvious political objectives, is super important. Movements, theorists, and organizations have to do this, or they will fail. When these things get blurred, a group might end up making a temporary concession, costing them a permanent victory, or be unable to drop what is just a tactical consideration as somehow a principle. This often comes up in electoralism. Electoralism, for me, is a strategy. It's not a principle. Democracy might be a principle, but how you get to a democratic society, that's maybe not democratic in and of itself, ironically. So when things get blurred like this, we need to take apart and build from the distinctions of these orientations. Now, there's nothing in the universe, there's no platonic form, ironically, given that we were just talking about Plato, but there's no platonic form of these orientations. But I find that these are some of the best ways to think about the situation of achieving goals in social life, and particularly in political life. When I map on programmatism or programmatic unity onto this, some of it will make sense. Like the reason why I actually believe in a three-stage set of demands, and that a political organization, even if it's not a party, needs a program. It needs a long-term program, which is where its principles or vision is. It's a maximalist program. It's what you ultimately want to achieve, almost in a utopian sense. It is where your virtues politically are derived from. And it has to be in accordance with the material world and the people who you see as the subject of that politics. And we're going to talk about what all that means. Whereas the immediate demands and the minimum program are both tactics and strategies. Their tactics create space for the strategies to take effect. For example, I might, and things might be multiple things. Like I tactically might think we need to start with socialized medicine because it's been proven to be achievable in the capitalist world, and it would be a major benefit for most of society. But as a tactical and strategic concern, it might be a moral principle for me that everyone deserves health care. But the moral principle about deservingness should not be confused with the tactical need of deploying socialized medicine. When we get into some specific debates, maybe this will make more sense, but I need to actually lay out what I see as the 5 major layers of political action. And we'll talk about this in light of programmatism too. We will start with the most concrete and move to the most abstract, because these also kind of fall in line with what you should be doing orientationally. And we can look at the end, maybe look at some major theories that undergird them. But let's stick with these layers here. The first layer, and the most concrete and immediate, are tactics. They're highly contextual actions taken to achieve a specific short-term goal. They're highly adaptable, and they depend on the immediate terrain. Tactics include organizing a strike, launching a boycott, running a specific ad campaign, filibustering a bill, hosting a protest, supporting a candidate. Notice that supporting a candidate is tactical. I'm going to have to do a whole video on how people confuse political representation with political agency, and how, I've actually made videos about this in the past, but apparently people still don't get it. So we're going to come back, because this is a mistake that it's related to this, that this is confusing a tactic like support for Zohran Mamdani for a principle, as we should support Zohran Mamdani as a representative of socialism or some shit. That's why I always say when we adjudicate about politicians, we should be very careful about making judgments early in their career, whether it's Obama or Mamdani. Obama's a clear case now. Mamdani, in a weird way, is like a socialist mirror of Obama in both the class base he pulled from and who he inspires hope in, and yet he's at a smaller level. He's at a city level, very important city, but at a city level. And so far, there are other parallels in that most of Mamdani's key programs are expansions of democratic programs, and the expansions are important, and they are in some ways radical expansions, but they are not as separate as a lot of the left populists who support him want you to believe. Whether it's David Sirota or Ken Clapperstein, there's a whole lot of investment in making things like the relatively limited rent freeze for rent stabilized apartments for 2 years into a completely unique win when it's based off of a law that manifests in 2019 and has been used by Bill de Blasio twice. What makes Mamdani's unique is the scale is larger and the length of time is larger, although it still only affects like 40% of apartments in New York. Right? Now, I don't have a critique of that, actually. Tactically, that is smart. You do need to build from existing laws, but there are problems with that. And the problems with that actually happen at other places. They're strategic errors. Because if you over rely on the people who you are technically opposing within your party and they control your framework, like Hochul does a lot of Mamdani's financing, then all of a sudden you could have a problem later on where Mamdani is going to have to capitulate more and more to certain factions in the Democratic Party that he opposes that are not interested in his agenda, or he's going to have to lose that support. How does he adjudicate that? Well, we don't know that yet. And we don't even know necessarily how that's going to happen. We can be pretty sure that it will probably happen, although maybe he's a smooth enough politician to keep the people above him in line with him for a long time. I don't know. All right. But that's a tactical issue, believe it or not. It is not even a strategic one yet. All right. But tactics are about actions. They're things that you do for specific reasons. Now, there's a trap with tactics, and it's called tactical fetishism. And that is when you treat a tactic like a street protest or electoral campaign or electoralism as a strategy or even a principle in and of itself. I mean, I'm going to get to an example of people doing this that I find absurd. And both sides of a debate I'm going to talk about later on do this. Like, they confuse strategic and tactical errors all over the place. And it's on both sides of the debate. So clarifying what you want, how you're going to get it, and what it means on the grand chessboard is all important before you actually deal with tactics. But the tactics are the most concrete thing you do, which is why people get most invested in them. What's the purpose of a protest? If you believe Sarah Stein Lobato's work, it's actually to bring activists together and to deal with politics in the meat space as opposed to political fandoms, which are actually not all that effective. But also that she's quite right, actually, that the research does not support the idea that protesting is particularly effective. In fact, even many of the victories given to protests, like the Vietnam War or the situation in South Africa, have underlying major things that shifted that have nothing to do with the protest and enabled the change to happen. I mean, one is the success of the Vietnamese army and the Viet Cong and the Vietnam War. In South Africa, it is the fact that the Black workforce was super important to South African development in a way that, like, say, the Palestinian workforce, particularly the Gazan workforce, and I put that in quotations because they're often excluded from work deliberately, is not. Um, and that South Africa was denuclearized by the policy of George Herbert Walker Bush, even when they weren't truly even recognizing apartheid completely. That denuclearization set the capacity of any protests and stuff to work in hand, and the boycotts did have an effect. But you do have to look at the entire field of play, both materially and strategically, before saying if a tactic is going to work. But a lot of people teach tactics as if they're their own ends. I don't actually give a shit about protesting. If it achieves something, great. And sometimes what I want to achieve with protesting is not obvious, and it's not actually the same thing as what the protest is about. So, like, for example, I had no delusions about protest in Salt Lake, about stuff after December of October 7th, 2023, as being able to change American military policy. I had no delusion about that. But I did think that supporting a local Palestinian community that felt relatively isolated was worth doing, both morally as a principle and strategically, um, as a way to build solidaristic lines with other groups. That's a tactic. Let's get to strategy. Strategy is a broader plan that coordinates various tactics over time to achieve political objectives. If tactics are winning a battle, a strategy is how you win a campaign. But it requires an assessment of your situation and your forces versus your opponent's situation and your opponent's forces. So a strategy can be passing a series of major legislative pieces, unionizing an industry, particularly one that is not highly unionized and is logistically or strategically important, or winning a specific election cycle that allows you to change the direction of other elections. If you look at the way the Democratic Party is often functioned, they're often really bad at strategy and really good at tactics. Whereas the GOP is often won ways on changing the chessboard strategically. And I could go into theories about why the Dems are bad at this and the Republicans somewhat good at this, even if what they're doing with the strategy is terrible and even sometimes counterproductive to them. They are still more strategically oriented. Then there is grand strategy. This is the coordination of all resources, ideological, economic, social, militaristic, etc., to achieve a structural shift in the state of affairs. If we think about it in terms of geopolitics, it is how a nation secures its place in the geopolitical order. And a revolutionary or social movement is the overarching theory of how society transforms from point A to point B, and how you intend to achieve that. So containment or detente during the Cold War is a grand strategy. Neoliberal implementation of global free markets through labor arbitrage and international courts is a grand strategy. BRICS buildup of gold and of counter economic power to the IMF and to Euro-American dominance is a grand strategy. Now, there's a bunch of traps in grand strategy too, though. You can overextend yourself, which is imperial overreach generally, or you can be blind to certain material conditions that have shifted since you actually laid out your grand strategy. You can have Pyrrhic victories where your grand strategy is so aimed at one thing, it costs you everything else later on down the line because you defeated your primary enemy, but now you don't have an orientation for yourself. Now, while strategies traps usually happens from decoupling tactical plans from ultimate goals and not having stages, grand strategy can be world historic when it really botches, particularly if you actually achieve your first stages of your strategy and then things fall apart later. You can actually see the collapse of the Soviet Union as a failure of grand strategy in a way. Now, this requires something that's more abstract, but actually permeates all these three below levels, and this is orientations. Orientation is an underlying disposition, framework, or understanding, ideological or otherwise, through which a political actor interprets political reality and prioritizes problems. Are the lens, our posture that dictates the kind of strategies that look viable to you and look acceptable to you. Orientations are above grand strategy because they still inform the way you understand and relate to each step we've talked about. So, tactics, strategy, and grand strategy are subordinated to the orientations, which are the underlying things you're trying to generate, which lead to the ability to enact those strategies. They should come from your principles, which is our next step, but it's a lens or posture that dictates what kind of strategies comes up, what you can use, and what you find morally acceptable. So, reformism versus revolution is an orientation. A revolutionary reformism, the combination of the two is an orientation. Internationalism versus cosmopolitanism versus national sovereignty is an orientation. Populism versus class politics is an orientation, etc. Reifying an orientation so deeply that you cannot see structural shifts in reality is a problem that idealists in particular often have, but even materialists who don't realize what's going on can do. So you cannot handle things that don't fit into your pre-existing framework. And so if your orientations are off, every single thing beneath it, grand strategy, tactics, can be off. And your orientation is a combination of normative and descriptive judgments. So, an orientational judgment could be how you describe a situation, accurately or not, because each description requires some use of norms to set that up. Norms being things that you see as normative and binding, like laws or habitats or whatever, um, but are not necessarily purely in sync with a pure objective description of reality, because a pure objective description of reality is not really something you can totally put into a language or a model. Because if you could put it totally into a language or a model, it would just be the thing, right? There's always a step of removal. So if you reify these orientations too strongly and are unable to change them when they need to be changed, you often will have all your dominoes fall. Lastly, there are principles. The principles are normative. In historical materialism, we view them as flowing from descriptive reality, right? So our principles should be in line with descriptive reality, but they're still principles. These are foundational, non-negotiable. They're philosophical, political, moral, and ethical values that determine the why of a project. These are relatively static and serve as both a strategic and moral orientation. So, liberty, equality, and solidarity is a set. Collective self-determination is a set. Preservation of traditional authority is a set of principles. The abolition of capitalism and the maintenance of a class abolished society is a set of principles. The trap here, though, is principles can become idealistic. They can become moralistic without any teeth. People can confuse principles with everything else in politics. Because a lot of liberals today don't recognize these distinctions, they will talk about how politics is personal and that politics and morality are inseparable, which is absurd to me, because those are operate at different levels. Morality tends to be personal. Politics is not. Having pristine principles that you cannot engage with are make tactically viable probably aren't principles that can become a political movement. So this is where you come from here. If you think about this, for example, the maximalist program is a set of orientation derived from communist principles, which we hopefully derive from the laws of history themselves in a scientific manner. At least that's what Marx hoped, or Marx and Engels hoped. The minimum program is the strategy to come into power and start transitioning towards socialism. So it's subordinated to the maximalist program, but is more conceivable and concrete. Tactics are how you achieve that program. Tactics is electing politicians to enact the program, or doing strikes to enact the program, or whatever you're doing to enact the program. But those are tactical concerns. Those are not orientations and they're not principles. And remember what I said at the beginning: even if democracy is a principle, electoralism in and of itself is not the same thing as a principle about democracy. Now, there's a couple of different theoretical frameworks that are used in the West for this. There's classical realism, um, which is a tradition that we can kind of see starting with Claude von Clausewitz. Famously, the war is a continuation of politics by other means guy. In his view, grand strategy and strategy are the supreme dictators. Principles are often treated as rhetorical cover, an ideological cover, to justify the pursuit of power or security between nation states who are in a war of all against all. Tactics are subordinate to strategic survival of the state, or the leadership cadre or whatever. But ultimately, strategy dominates both grand strategy and immediate strategy. So the strategy for winning the war and the strategy for winning the campaign. Marxists actually have a pretty structured relationship between these layers, and this is manifested in a couple of different Marxist theories. One that's come fashionable lately is the Gramscian strategy of positions, one that I see abused quite a bit. And the other is tactical adaptability from Lenin. And this is rooted in an analysis of class power and of historical development, both structural and physical. For Lenin principles, the overthrow of capitalism and proletariat power were rigid, but tactics to achieve those principles were fluid. He argued that a vanguard party and its entire infrastructure must be willing to shift from legal parliamentary work to clandestine underground organizing overnight, altering all of its subordinate principles to those times. So, like, democratic centralism is in play when you are focusing legally, but it's actually not super relevant when you're clandestine because you can't even have that much democracy. Compromises like Breslovis may be necessary for the long-term survival of a strategy. So he also really encouraged strategic adaptability, but tactical adaptability was huge for him. If you read Lenin, sometimes he reads like an electoralist, sometimes he reads like an anti-electoralist. It depends on the situation he's in, and he gets this sometimes from Marx, as Marx's relationship towards what we do in elections was somewhat shifting. Now, they both thought that anti-electoralism as a principle was an ultra-leftist mistake. For that was part of the war of Engels and Marx in the First International, and it was definitely one of the issues that Lenin had with Bordiga and the Council Communists during the Third International. That does not necessarily mean that Lenin was secretly scheming to have a non-democratic society. I mean, we have no idea what was in Lenin's soul, but it doesn't seem like he was. What it does seem like is he thought that you needed to shift, and tactical adaptability created for that. Now, there are people who argue that the tactical and strategic adaptability, like by the 1940s, became principal adaptability, and that's its own problem. But a lot of Lenin's thought can strike you as highly contradictory if you don't see the fact that he is making these decisions based on tactical constraints at any given time. Another example would be Gramsci's strategy of positions, which the thinkers at Geese magazine have really used. It was also popular at Viewpoint magazine for a completely different reason. But Gramsci used the concept of war of maneuvers, which is a direct assault on the state, and the war of position, which is a long-term strategy to build cultural hegemony through civil society before taking power and making the maintenance of power more possible, as two things to think about. So you had the war of maneuver and the war of position. And so the war of maneuver is strategic and tactical, and the war of position is grand strategic And they're both subordinated to the principles of building a party which can overthrow class society. So you have an orientation dealing with the two different wars. The cultural institutions are used for an orientation to bring back the party to build proletarian power. It is not for its own sake, but that it is a way to have long-term effects. And this becomes a strategic outlook that emerges from the orientation. If we look at Gramsci, um, what about liberal and institutionalist arguments? Um, so liberal theory views politics as a process of conflict resolution for the most part, interest aggregation, and rules following within structural institutions, often guided by principles. Principles such as individual rights or rule of law or the right to property dictate the limits of acceptable strategy and tactics. So the orientation is deeply procedural. The process matters as much or more than the outcome because the principles are manifested in the process for most liberals. Strategy involves coalition building, horse trading, and electoral maneuvering within established legal boundaries for most liberal, pluralist, and institutionalist frameworks. So weirdly, principles and tactics rule where strategy is a little bit more subordinated to both the bottom and top ends of these layers, if you want to see them as hierarchical. So when analyzing any political movement, a party, or a historical event, a helpful diagnostic tool is to look for where the gears are grinding and where these layers are operating. Are they using tactics that actively undermine their stated principles? Is their strategy mismatched with their actual material orientation? Is their strategy at odds with their tactics? Have they confused a tactic for a principle? I'm going to talk about an example of this in a second. True political efficacy usually occurs when there is a coherent logical line flowing from tactics, strategies, grand strategies, orientations that enable all the above, which flow from principles. Now, we should be a little bit nominalist in this. These, again, are not things that are obvious in a lot of ways. I could even tie this into like Stanford Beer's cybernetic theories of a system if I wanted to. In fact, I might do another video on that, but this is really important. I'm going to, however, talk about how we might see this manifest. So if you think about the tension that came up somewhat recently from Brianna Joy Gray, who has been hosting Bad Faith and pushing Force the Vote since 2020, and actually even before that, and a figure like Dan DeVere, who hosts The Dig and organizes the Reclaim Rhode Island movement, you see a concrete test of how these layers get confused. Gray and DeVere had an argument on episode 5 something. Let's see. Let me actually look that up real fast. Episode 5 89. Okay. That kind of exploded. And while there are some shared core principles, there's a call for material distribution, there's democratic socialism, there's call for a decommodification of healthcare and education, there's a general populist alignment that I don't like in either one of them, frankly. And also a general left-wing orientation, at least economically. Their breakdown occurs because of some confusions of strategy, grand strategy, and tactic, and some sincere differences on strategy and grand strategy and tactic. So this really can illustrate how these categories can get conflated and how they can cause problems. So the first debate that really caused an explosion between DeVere and Brianna Gray was the forced to vote debate. Vanadroy Gray demanded that progressive members of the Congress, particularly the Squad, withhold their votes for Nancy Pelosi as Speaker of the House unless she guaranteed a floor vote for Medicare for all. The theory was that when they didn't have a floor vote for Medicare for all, this would expose the corporate Democrats as frauds. She has been arguing for this along with Jimmy Dore, who I don't think is as clearly left-wing as her, but that's neither here nor there, as a method of exposure for Jimmy Dore, it's been almost a decade. I have found this fascinating because while this is often called ultra-leftism or a strategic mistake, I find it interesting because it's a tactic being conflated with a principle. Our flow vote on Revere, destined to fail in the Democratic controlled House and a Republican Senate, is purely symbolic, and it's a media tactic that assumes that that most of the working class did not know that the Democratic Party did not actually support a Medicare for all, which I find it hilarious because there have been floor votes and things like this, and even attempts like by Hillary Clinton in the early 1990s to bring something like a healthcare program through, and it's been sabotaged every time. And so anyone with any political memory whatsoever would know that the Democratic Party does not actually support this, even when they kind of throw peons to it. And while there might be a strategic shift that would enable it, there's been no evidence of that because a lot of the same people that were in power in the 80s in the Democratic Party are in power now. The floor that came in, particularly by 2006 under George W. Bush, has been the primary leadership for a long time. And Hakeem Jeffries has been a person that we talked about my entire life. That is not an immediate assessment of power. And also, it is confusing a symbolic gesture that might provoke a backlash with a principle. Now, I get that a lot of people read this as a critique of the DSA strategy because it is. And there are some real points that I think Vanadroy Gray does land, but this one's always confused me as why people think it's so important because it's a tactic. Just like electoralism in general is a tactic. All right. Get that through your head. Making a tactical concession the primary hill on which you wish to fall on your sword is a weird move for me politically. And it actually is sort of a resentment politics of someone not listening to you. At least a lot of the times. I don't know if it's the case with Vanadroy Gray. I think she sincerely believes what she's saying. The problem is she treats it as if it is a principle or at least a grand strategy, and it is neither. But what's the problem with Denvir here? So Devere's strategy, which is the inside-outside strategy, a ballot line and donor bike, has a bunch of problems. Utilizing the Democratic Party ballot line as a functional tool because of its structural, legal, and historical barriers to third parties in the U.S. makes some sense because most third parties at best become sects and usually fail very quickly. The strategy is to build an independent member-led working class organization outside the party that can mount a primary challenge within local seats and build institutions, muscle it up from the bottom. The issue is, however, it's totally dependent on all the resources controlled by the enemies that you're actually fighting. DSA has to use DAC Blue. Reclaim Rhode Island has to use a lot of the same resources as the Democratic Party and gets them from the Democratic Party. So while you're in internal opposition that has announced your opposition and is dependent on the infrastructure of your internal competition to be successful. Furthermore, there's legal problems with a principled ballot line being held in any sincere way because of the structure of primaries and everything else in the United States. And I might go into that in another video. I'm definitely going to get into that in another video on Patreon. So just so you know. Vanadroy Gray takes the following from the Sanders defeat that she shifted heavily towards abandoning the Democratic Party entirely, viewing it as unreformable, and also any attempt to take it over is limited by these very things that I was mentioning in Cranston DeVere. And I think she's got a point here, actually. Her strategies become centered on building an independent alternative like the People's Party or the Green Party, and leveraging voting blocks to withhold votes from Democrats, to force concessions with those third parties. So she doesn't think you can do it by just getting rid of the Democrats overnight. She's not that foolish, nor does she think that you can just declare a third party, although sometimes it sounds like it with the People's Party. So, neither here nor there. Now, I don't think either one of these people. I listen to both their shows periodically. I'm not a religious listener to most left podcasts, actually, but I've listened to The Dig and to Bad Faith before. And what I find interesting about this is that they both see a similar enemy, but their strategic orientation is different, and they both have severe flaws. The flaws for Breanne Joy Gray's strategy is the legal flaws, and that most of these third parties are at best going to get concessions by denying votes to Democrats, but they're only themselves successful in areas that aren't really easily tradable. So they tend to be downstream of progressive Democrats anyway, just like the DSA does. And because of that, they cannot achieve more than 1 or 2% of the vote. And even their spoiler capacity is somewhat muted. So strategically, from my standpoint, both of these strategies have severe flaws, and that's not even dealing with the fact I think their populist orientation is not helpful. So there's a strategic rift on two lines. So Gray's framework heavily prioritizes ideological warfare, exposing contradictions, and basically spectacular politics using media platforms and political stunts to change the narrative to radicalize individuals. So for her, power is built by shifting public consciousness and drawing stark, uncompromising lines, while also pointing out the failure of Democrats at every turn. Denver's is an institutional base building strategy, but it's an institutional base building strategy separate from like a socialist base building strategy. In his view, seemingly consciousness follows organization. Power is built by slow work of organizing various different groups and funneling them to grievances to construct a counter hegemony in already existing institutions. You will note that neither one of these would meet a historical definition of a revolutionary politics. In fact, one might argue that neither one of these even reached the level of early 20th century reformist politics, because what they want to do is actually relatively limited compared to Fabian or social democratic reformists before World War II. So they both have flaws. They both have, from my perspective, an orientation toward populism that leads them to try to ignore or soften divisions within the non-elites versus everyone else. They're both still dependent on political power being somewhat downstream of either media in the case of Gray or institutions in the case of Navier. And this is also a problem. But what you see is a difference in strategy where both strategies have flaws. You also see a fetishization of tactics. In the case of Breanne Droger, it's obvious. In the case of Denvier, I think it actually is still there. He seems to think this slow institutional base building is also the right thing to do, and also thus conflating it with a principle as well as a tactic. Now, he might disagree with me on that. I'd love to hear his thoughts on it. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, but nonetheless, that seems to be the case. We can kind of look at the debate between Vladimir Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg, particularly on the national question, which I've done a lot on recently. I did a whole seminar for my Patreons and some other temporary subscribers for it this year, and so I can talk about it. And you have two of the most brilliant theorists of second, turn, third international Marxism. I mean, who shared identical principles in many ways, but were diametrically opposed on grand strategies and on tactics. And there was other reasons for those differences. They weren't some of those differences became from orientations or theoretical considerations. All right. They were both deeply committed Marxist internationalists, Neither was a true nationalist in any like exclusivist or chauvinistic sense. For Lenin, nationalism was a grand strategic necessity, and also a tactical necessity. So it was both, but it was something to be overcome by the international developing. For Luxembourg, she thought this was impossible. Um, and because of that, and because of the unification of capital, she thought that oppressed nations breaking away to form their own independent capitalist states could be a distraction from overall socialist movements. Their principles are very similar. And people, anarchists will sometimes refer Rosa Luxemburg as one of their own, but it's actually amazing how much that she shared with Lenin. She shared a different analysis of imperialism and a different analysis of the nation state. Luxemburg's orientation really was almost pure unmediated internationalism, almost cosmopolitanism, and that is not the same thing as internationalism either, but that could be its own video. That she thought national identity was a bourgeois trick to divide the working class and to make capitalism easier to administer. Any concession to nationalism for her, even the nationalism of past groups like the Poles under the Russian Empire, was a dangerous diversion from class struggle and could lead to even more isolated workers within those subordinated nations who would then be imperialized by other means. Lenin's internationalism was not an abstract idea either, but he thought it had to be constructed by smashing real world hierarchies between empires. And this could be best done by liberating nations who could also form coherent national blocks and rationalize their production because they spoke the same language. Thus, you could not have true international solidarity if the workers in an oppressor nation ignored the boot their own ruling class placed on the back of an oppressed nation. And thus, it was smart to support national liberation groups from the standpoint of you not hurting your own nation. And Lenin went so far as to say Luxembourg's mistake was that she based this too much on a smaller nation like Poland, who didn't have the leverage. So Luxembourg's grand strategy is actually stated in her work, The Accumulation of Capital, which is basically her work on imperialism. And you can go back and see my episode on that. Luxembourg argued that capitalism inherently requires non-capitalist territories to exploit to deal with its declining rates of profit and, other things about consumption that I have gone over and not sure I fully understand. By her logic, by 1914, the world was fully partitioned at this point. She believed that creating new small nations was a historical anachronism and economically impossible because those nations would then be subordinated to big capitalist interests anyway. Her grand strategy was a unified simultaneous assault on the global proletariat against global capital. National independence movements were just not relevant to that. And if they were relevant, they would only install a local bourgeoisie. And since capitalism had already been nationalized by the early 20th century, internationalized by the early 20th century, why would you need to do that? Lenin's grand strategy, which he details in Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism and what is to be done, but particularly in Imperialism in this battle, what is to be done is this larger strategic document. So global capitalism is a chain that could be broken at weakest links. So he thought that capitalism was no longer just national, that it was a global system, and it was an imperial system, just like Luxembourg said. But that the strategy was combine the socialist workers movement in the advanced West with the democratic anti-colonial national liberation movements in the East to tear down the imperialist core from both sides. Obviously, only one of those sides happened, but that was seemingly his strategy. We can debate if that was actually his strategy, but I think that is a terrible reading of the grand strategy here. So you have two different grand strategic visions. Luxembourg thinks that capitalism is going to exhaust itself, leading for everybody to be able to attack it all at once globally because of its exhaustion of its own resources. Lenin does not think capitalism is going to necessarily go into final crisis immediately like that. And he thought that you could peel stuff off the weakest link. So For Luxemburg, this led to a different strategy on the intermediate level. Oppose all national succession movements, force workers of oppressor nations and oppressed nations to work together and be in the exact same organization to fight their bosses side by side internationally. She was a fierce opponent of Polish independence. She argued that Polish and Russian workers must fight together against the Tsar, and the national phase is relevant here. Lenin argued that voluntary integration is necessary for the international to be actually international, unless you had to guarantee a right to separate. He famously compares the right to self-determination to the right of divorce. Advocating for a legal right of divorce doesn't mean you want every marriage to end. It just means the marriage can only be healthy if it is entirely voluntary. If you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. So by championing the rights of oppressed nations to leave, the Russian workers would prove to the Polish or Ukrainian workers that they did not harbor imperialist ambitions. And therefore, there would be a basis of trust for a socialist federation to emerge organically. This also ties into later debates about socialism in one country, but Luxemburg is dead by that point, so it doesn't come up here. At the immediate level of tactics, Luxemburg called for the denouncement of all calls of rights of self-determination, whereas Lenin thought that you had to split it up. The socialist and oppressing nations must demand the freedom of secession for their colonies, because they should not be chauvinist and they should not be helping their ruling class. But socialist and oppressed nations should combat should emphasize the unity of all workers and combat their own local bourgeois nationalism, but being willing to break away from these massive empires. So there's a way in which both the Luxemburg and Lenin debates mirror the Gray and De Vere debates, even though they're very, very different. Luxemburg and Gray insist on a refusal to compromise with institutional frameworks they deem outdated or corrupt, and they favor sharp, more immediate breaks. Lenin and De Vere are diagnostic and have a relational approach to power. And they have to deal with compromised institutional realities, but they see this as a transitional tactic. Now, I would think, I don't want to say that Lenin and De Vere are on the same level. They absolutely are not. I just, because that actually makes it sound like I'm siding with De Vere or dismissing Gray or Luxemburg. I actually think a lot of Gray's points about the Democratic Party are valid. The issue that you have is that how sharp do you need the change to be? So we could talk about this in terms of the First International, but I think we're going to skip that for today. We might do a follow-up video where I do talk about it. So there's going to be a few videos that follow up on this in the Patreon only. I'm just going to tell you that. So if you're interested, you can get access for as little $4. We do Patreon only episodes, usually about once a week, as well as the 3 episodes that we usually put out here, which is 2 solo episodes that are shorter and 1 long, up to 3 to 4 hours sometimes, interview episode that I do on Tuesdays. Well, I don't do them on Tuesdays, but I release them on Tuesdays. They are simulcast, but usually pre-recorded so I can edit them. I'm going to put the show notes in the link so you can find Daniel De Vere, Brianna Joy Gray debate, and some other statements on it. I also think people should not watch that preemptively picking a side, because they both make decent points and they both have some pretty big structural flaws, as I've tried to point out today. So you should check that out. But you should also check out this work. If you want to support me, you can buy my book with Daniel Tutt. It's available from Revo Press, and you can find it on Amazon and all good booksellers. Man, I hate this petit bourgeois selling stuff I have to do at the end of all the shows, but nonetheless. So do it if you want it. And if you don't want it, that's fine. I'm not going to be mad about it. You should read my book though. If you don't want to pay for it, get your library to buy it. That still helps me. You don't have to pay for it. Con someone else and paying for it. That's even better. Then all kinds of people can have it, even if you get a state actor to pay for it. Good job. But anyway, so another thing you can do to support me if you don't have money, you don't want access to my Patreon, you don't want my little pamphlet book with Daniel Tutt, is you can comment. Tell me who you side with. Do you think Denvir or Bridgeroy Gray is more valid, or do you see my point that they both have flaws? And I didn't go into my issues of orientations, but if you read my book with Daniel Tutt, you would see that I have an orientation issue with them as well. How do you like that for subtle sales pitches? I'm done with the sales pitch part of this because it makes me feel gross too. So I hope you protect your peace like a smart person, that you like and subscribe if you haven't yet, if you're remotely interested in this stuff. And if you're not, that's fine. Fuck off. And have a good day, even if you do decide to merely fuck off. And if you do want to help me and you don't have money, share it, comment. Big helps. Hit the bell, maybe, so you know when I release stuff. This is not a monetized channel. They still probably put ads in front of it most of the time, but I don't get any of that money. So the only money I get is Patreon. But I do like this to grow. I want people to see it. You can even remix it. Don't use me in AI though. That's the one thing I'll get pissy about. Don't generate fake me's. But you can remix this how you like. I don't care. I really don't. So go have fun with it and protect your peace. And I like to thank my Patreons who make this possible, because without them, I would stop doing this and go get another third job or whatever. So have a great day. Bye-bye.